In the early 1600s, there was a moment when a country smaller than many modern cities quietly owned the world, not through armies, not through conquest, but through contracts, ships, and ink. On paper, Amsterdam's harbor was a forest of masts. The air smelled of salt, spices, and money. From a single port flowed pepper from Indonesia, silk from China, sugar from the Caribbean, and silver that crossed oceans before it ever touched land. The Dutch did not rule by crowns or banners. They ruled by balance sheets. At the heart of this empire stood a company, not a king, the Dutch East India Company, the first multinational corporation in history. It could wage war, sign treaties, build cities, and execute prisoners. Its shares were traded daily in Amsterdam, in what many historians consider the world's first true stock exchange. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the Dutch Republic became the engine of global trade. London borrowed from it, France envied it, Spain feared it, and yet barely a century later it was gone. The Dutch did not lose their empire in a single war. There was no dramatic collapse, no burning capital, no final surrender. Instead, their empire bled out quietly, through debt, through overconfidence, through systems that once made them rich, but later made them fragile. By the time the world realized what was happening, the Dutch were no longer shaping history. They were watching it pass them by. This is the story of how the most advanced commercial empire on earth, an empire built on innovation, finance, and global reach, slowly dismantled itself, not because it lacked power, but because it trusted its system too much. And systems, unlike empires, do not forgive. To understand how the Dutch lost their empire, you first have to understand why it worked so spectacularly well. The Dutch Republic was not like the monarchies that surrounded it. There was no absolute king, no single throne. Power was fragmented, shared between merchants, city councils, and provincial elites. This was not a weakness. It was the source of their strength. While other empires chased glory, the Dutch chased efficiency. They built ships faster and cheaper than anyone else. Dutch shipyards perfected standardized designs that could be assembled quickly, repaired cheaply, and crewed with fewer men. A Dutch merchant ship could undercut a Spanish or Portuguese rival on price alone, and still turn a profit, but ships were only the visible surface. The real engine was finance. Amsterdam became the clearinghouse of the world. Its banks offered stable credit, its currency was trusted. Its stock exchange allowed risk to be shared instead of borne by kings. War, trade, exploration, everything could be financed by investors willing to gamble on returns. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, embodied this system perfectly. It was not just a trading company. It was a state within a state. It commanded armies in Asia. It governed territories. It enforced monopolies with brutal efficiency. And it paid dividends that made Amsterdam's elite unimaginably wealthy. This was capitalism before the word existed. The Dutch did not need vast populations or endless land. They controlled choke points, ports, straits, islands, and trade routes. They did not conquer continents. They inserted themselves into global circulation like a valve controlling the flow without owning the whole system. For decades it worked flawlessly. Money flowed in, risk flowed out. Competitors fell behind. But the same machine that made the Dutch unstoppable also made them dangerously dependent on one thing: uninterrupted trade. And trade, unlike land or people, can vanish overnight. The Dutch Empire was not built to absorb shocks. It was built to maximize returns. That distinction would soon matter more than anyone in Amsterdam could imagine. For a long time, the Dutch benefited from a simple advantage. They understood the new world before anyone else did. They understood finance. They understood logistics. They understood that power no longer came only from land and armies, but from flows of goods, credit, and information. But advantages are temporary. Other nations watched, and they learned. England was the most dangerous student. By the mid-17th century, English merchants and politicians had studied the Dutch model closely. They copied Dutch ship designs. They modernized their ports. They restructured their financial system. London's banks began to resemble Amsterdam's. The English state learned how to borrow cheaply, reliably, and at scale. Then England did something the Dutch system was never designed to handle. It fused finance with force. The Dutch had always preferred neutrality. War disrupted trade, and trade was everything. England, however, was willing to use violence to rewrite the rules of commerce. The Navigation Acts barred foreign ships from English ports. Suddenly, Dutch merchants once, welcome everywhere, found themselves locked out of their most profitable markets. This was not a traditional war. It was economic warfare. The Anglo-Dutch wars that followed were devastating, not because the Dutch lost battles, but because their margins collapsed. Each ship sunk meant lost capital. Each blockade meant broken contracts. Each disruption rippled through the financial system back in Amsterdam. Meanwhile, France began building its own mercantilist empire. Colbert reorganized French industry. Spain, weakened but not dead, still controlled vast silver flows. The global economy was no longer a playground for one small republic. The Dutch system assumed open seas, predictable trade, and limited state interference. The world was becoming something else. Empires were learning to weaponize trade itself, and the Dutch masters of commerce were discovering a fatal weakness. They had built an empire optimized for peace in a world that was rapidly choosing conflict. At the height of Dutch power, wealth seemed endless. Amsterdam's canals filled with grand houses. Art flourished. Rembrandt painted merchants like kings. Ordinary citizens invested in global ventures that spanned oceans they would never see. For a time, the Dutch Republic felt invincible. But wealth has side effects. As profits accumulated, priorities shifted. The Dutch elite became conservative not politically, but financially. They preferred stability over risk, dividends over reinvestment, interest over innovation. Capital began to flow inward instead of outward. Rather than funding new industries or technologies, Dutch money increasingly went into government bonds, foreign loans, and rent-seeking investments. Amsterdam became the banker of Europe, but bankers do not always control the future. They finance it for others. This was the quiet turning point. While Dutch capital funded English shipyards, French armies, and foreign infrastructure, domestic industry stagnated. Wages rose, costs increased. Dutch manufacturers found it harder to compete with cheaper English or French producers who were still climbing, still hungry. The empire was becoming a portfolio, not a project. The Dutch East India Company, once the most dynamic enterprise on earth, grew bloated and corrupt. Its administrators prioritized short-term dividends over long-term control. Smuggling flourished, military costs soared. Local resistance in Asia intensified. Instead of adapting, the VOC borrowed. Debt replaced innovation. The same financial sophistication that once fueled expansion now masked decline. Losses were rolled over. Accounts were manipulated. Dividends were paid even when profits vanished funded by loans rather than trade. To investors in Amsterdam, everything still looked fine. But beneath the surface, the empire was hollowing out. The Dutch had not lost their empire yet. They were still rich, still influential, but they were no longer dangerous. And in the world of empires, that distinction is fatal. By the early 18th century, the Dutch Republic appeared calm on the surface. There were no revolutions, no famines, no dramatic collapses. But beneath that, calm sat a dangerous illusion. The belief that financial dominance could replace political and military power. The Dutch had become creditors to the world. Their money financed English wars, Austrian armies, and even the growing ambitions of Prussia. Interest payments flowed steadily back to Amsterdam. To many in the Dutch elite, this seemed like the perfect evolution of empire profit without bloodshed. But creditors depend on debtors remaining strong, and debtors, once strong enough, no longer need their lenders. England is the clearest example. Dutch capital helped build British industry, ports, and fleets. It financed wars that expanded British influence across the globe. By the time Britain surpassed the Dutch, it did so using tools partially paid for by Dutch money. The balance of power had shifted quietly. Meanwhile, the Dutch military shrank. Naval investment slowed. Fortifications decayed. The assumption was that neutrality and finance would protect the Republic, just as they always had. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. When war returned to the Low Countries, the Dutch found themselves exposed. Their army was too small, their navy outdated, their allies unreliable. Financial leverage could not stop invading troops. At the same time, the VOC's problems multiplied. Corruption drained profits. Administration costs ballooned. Wars in Asia consumed resources faster than trade could replace them. Instead of reforming, the company borrowed more, deepening its dependence on state support. What had once been a private engine of empire became a financial liability. The Dutch state now faced a cruel paradox. It was rich in paper wealth, but poor in real power. Money was everywhere, but control was nowhere. By trusting debt, dividends, and neutrality to preserve their position, the Dutch had surrendered the very tools that made empires durable: force, adaptability, and strategic ambition. They still believed they were in control. History was about to prove otherwise. Empires rarely collapse from a single blow. They fail when a shock arrives and reveals weaknesses that have been ignored for decades. For the Dutch Republic, that shock came in the late 18th century when Europe entered an era of total war. Mass mobilization, an ideological conflict that the Dutch system was utterly unprepared for. The French Revolution changed everything. France was no longer just a rival state. It became a revolutionary force that rejected old diplomatic norms, ignored financial caution, and mobilized entire populations for war. Armies were no longer small professional forces. They were massive national instruments. The Dutch had no answer for this world. Their defenses were outdated. Their army was underfunded. Their political system designed for consensus, and commerce was slow, divided, and paralyzed by internal factions. In 1795, French troops crossed into the Netherlands almost unopposed. There was no heroic last stand, no decisive battle. The Republic simply collapsed under pressure it could not absorb. The Batavian Republic replaced ETA French client state in all but name. This was the moment when the illusion shattered. Decades of financial wealth had not translated into resilience. The canals, banks, and trading houses offered no protection against mass armies. Neutrality meant nothing when ideology demanded alignment. Credit meant nothing when borders dissolved. At the same time, the Dutch East India Company finally imploded. Buried under debt, corruption, and military overreach, the VOC was nationalized and then dissolved. Its territories became state possessions, but without the profits that once justified their existence. The empire did not fall in flames. It simply stopped working. What remained was a wealthy society without strategic autonomy, a nation that had mastered global trade, only to discover that trade alone could not guarantee survival. The Dutch had not been defeated because they were weak. They were defeated because the world changed and they refused to change with it. After 1795, the Dutch did something remarkable. They survived. The Netherlands did not vanish. Its people did not descend into chaos. Its economy eventually stabilized. In many ways, it adapted better than older, more rigid empires. But it never reclaimed its imperial position. The reason is simple and brutal. The age of empires had moved on. When the Netherlands re-emerged after the Napoleonic Wars, the rules were no longer set by merchants and shipping companies. They were set by industrial states, with massive populations, standing armies, and centralized power. Britain dominated the seas. France projected influence through armies. Later, Germany and the United States harnessed industry at a scale the Dutch could never match. The Netherlands was too small, not culturally, not intellectually, but structurally. Its strength had always been efficiency, finance, and trade. Those were still valuable, but no longer decisive. Industrial empires rewarded coal, steel, manpower, and territory. The Dutch had none in abundance. Instead of trying to compete, the Netherlands chose a different path. It became a financial and commercial hub, again but without imperial ambition. Its remaining colonies, particularly in Indonesia, were administered pragmatically, often brutally, but without illusions of global dominance. Even those would eventually be lost. By the mid-20th century, decolonization finished what the French armies had begun. The Netherlands returned to what it had always done best, surviving through adaptation rather than conquest. The empire was gone not because it was stolen, but because it no longer fit the world that replaced it. The Dutch did not fail in the way Rome failed. They were not overthrown like Spain. They were not shattered like France. They were outgrown. The Dutch story carries a warning that modern nations still struggle to understand. Wealth is not power. Efficiency is not resilience. Finance cannot replace strategy. The Dutch built an empire, optimized for peace, trade, and rational calculation. It worked brilliantly until the world demanded something else. When crisis came, the system that maximized profit minimized flexibility. And when flexibility vanished, so did empire. This is not a story of stupidity or moral failure. It is a story of success taken too far, and that may be the most dangerous kind of failure of all.